you believe the system is racist, that the justice system does treat African Americans differently, and you see that in your own practice. You see that every single day in the courts, and yet
right. And this is what's so absolutely aggravating, and why I get so worked up when we're on these panels. I understand, and Sonny, this is not a shot at you as a former federal prosecutor, but when you hear people who say they're federal prosecutors or ex-federal prosecutors, they're dealing with white-collar criminals in
not
a
in
federal
DC,
court.
though. You know that, Mark.
Well, not in D.C. I know that. I understand. But I'm talking about in the state courts across this country. Every single day, as I sit in a courtroom and watch nothing but young black males get processed in and out of courtrooms in this country for what I consider to be the parking ticket of Superior Court. It usually involves some small amount of drugs or something drug-related. 80% of the cases that come through the criminal justice system, and the absolute institutionalized racism when it comes to blacks is overwhelming. I do not think for a second, though, that we should be injecting or trying to correct that in one case where here it's almost the exact flip side of what happened. What happened here was you had 6 white women or 5 white women on this jury. You talk about what Charles was talking about, that organizing principle. I just call it, and I've called it a couple of weeks ago, the prism through which they look. Early on, and one of the reasons I was all over Sonny on this case was because I understand, I think, from sitting in the trenches, that the prism through which they look is the same prism that George Zimmerman looks when he sees Trayvon Martin walking there. And then when you layer on all of the other nuances about this, and you put on the woman who had the home invasion, and you press all of those buttons, you play on and you absolutely build on this kind of archetype that is built into the system. And it is awful, and it happens every day and in the system. And I hate the fact that now we've kind of looked at it kind of backwards, in my opinion. But in my opinion...
But what I don't understand is why... So are you saying you do not believe race was a factor in this case? Or... I mean, because the prosecution went out of their way to not invoke race during the actual trial.
Let me show you again. When they started this jury selection, they started bouncing white women. Why did they do that? Because they were afraid, in my humble opinion, the prosecution was afraid that the white women were going to view Trayvon Martin through this prism of, as Charles says, it's a young black male. If this had been a young black female, I don't think it would have been a problem. If it had been a young white female, it would not have been a problem. But it was a young black male. That's why they started bouncing white women, exercising their peremptory challenges, to the point where the judge granted a Batson challenge and reseated 2 of those white women. That was when this case was over. There was race from the beginning in those prosecutors' minds. And instead of dealing with that, they ran away from it. And I'll go back to the other conundrum about this case. If George Zimmerman was anybody but a cop, he would have been arrested that night. That's something that every young black male in America knows, and that's something that everybody who's in the criminal justice system knows. You do not kill somebody and get a pass. The cops arrest first and ask questions later.
So when Mark O'Mara says that if George Zimmerman was black, this would have never gone to trial, you believe if George Zimmerman had been black, he would have been arrested that night?
If George Zimmerman had been black, he not only would have been arrested that night, but you would have had those very same prosecutors playing into that same racism. And I will guarantee you that there are plenty of Florida prosecutors, because I read the cases when they get reversed, who play into that and will argue and demonize that same prism when they've got the jurors who are going to be receptive to it. That's the schizophrenia about this case.
So, Charles, I mean, to you, what is this? I mean, does this case change anything? What can anything come out of this?
Well, I think it is an amazing focal point, right? So I think Mark is right in the sense that what makes this such an outlier is that is not just that it's an adult and a child. That's one of them. That the child is unarmed and the adult is armed. That there's disproportionate use of force, which is meaning Trayvon Martin is using his hands in however he's using them, and George uses a gun. And what we have to understand about that is that Trayvon could not have legally ever matched force with him. You cannot have a concealed carry weapon as a teenager in Florida. So we're already out of sorts. But the bigger point I think that upsets most people is that there was a grown man standing over a dead boy when the cops arrived, and that person was allowed to talk his way out of a precinct and go home to his own bed. We see people killed all the time. There's gun violence, unfortunately, in America all the time. People die. We don't expect for the police to know who did it and to let them walk away from it. That, I think, is such an aberrant thing for us. For any person in America of good conscience, for any parent, for any person who feels like they could be on the other end of that gun barrel, that it forces a different kind of conversation. And I think that's what focuses this particular case in a different way than other cases have been focused.